So the first thing I want to just say, I think there are three things I've heard already, which I couldn't agree with more. I mean, the first thing is there is absolutely no strategic element really to the planning white paper around things like social housing or how we get the homes built. And I also am shocked by the idea that we would have a sort of fast track for beauty that would use a computer to check images. I'll come back to that in a second and just explain why it's so worrying. But I also, I don't understand how so much of planning in the year 2021 seems to be about what things look like rather than how they work, when we know that carbon is being generated by housing and the movement around housing in particular. And there's so little in the planning white paper about that. It really makes you think that they're up to something else. So I just want to raise this as a question. Gavin Barwell, who was Chief of Staff to Theresa May and the Croydon MP before he lost his seat in May's mistaken election of 2017, he was on a fantastic Zoom chat about 9 months ago when he was asked by the journalist Peter Bill, what goes on in government that there seems to be so much policy and like so little refinement? Everything seems to be radical and so little seems to be about perfecting what we've already got floating along. And he said, well, essentially 90% of time in Marsham Street is spent on trying to chase a headline with a radical idea. And about 10% is spent on trying to perfect the stuff that's already out there, that nearly always needs about 50% of the time to perfect it. And he effectively identified the fact that if you want to get ahead in politics, you need to float something that you can call radical or different or extraordinary or remarkable. And there is very little of what we would call our most successful area of civilization, which is, precision engineering. Every year, engineers work out how to make a ball bearing work 0.1% better. And every year our cars get more efficient for it and everything else with it. We don't seem to do that with planning. We just seem to float massive ideas. So I'm going to talk about 6 areas of separation, 6 degrees really within the planning white paper and the documents that go with it, which I think they haven't really got their head around. And I also want to remind you, just from the very beginning, the people behind the planning white paper are not strictly Marsham Street. There is effectively a sort of triangle of influences here. There's the policy exchange, which is where a lot of people go to for ideas. And then there's the Conservative Party, because they are the government. And then there's Marsham Street. And this kind of triangle functions in such a way, I think, stuff comes out of the policy exchange that sounds exciting and thrilling to ministers who then insist that civil servants somehow make it work because it sounds so good they can't resist it. And this planning white paper, I think, has several things in it. One of the things I think they've completely misunderstood is that if you introduce consultation on a sort of exercise, a basis that they're talking about for virtually every single thing, including deciding where homes get built, what kind of homes get built, more consultation is useful. It's liberating, in particular, I think, in regeneration proposals. But when you're doing it in the shires and you're talking about bringing forward a greenfield site and you're asking people in the countryside, what do they think about having a scheme? It's just a process of slowing things down. They see consultation as an opportunity to make sure whatever might get built could possibly not get built through a war of attrition. So more consultation will mean a greater demand for more sites, because if the house builders have got, say, 1,000 sites running, and about 200 of those are caught up in extensive consultation exercises, then they will need to find 200 more. So every planning authority in the country is going to wake up one morning in the next 2 to 3 years and discover that the sites that they thought were sufficient for the local plan need to be supplemented. And I think this is going to be a big shock, in particular in many of the shires that vote for the people behind the current planning policy. So the second point I want to point out, coding and zoning, they work really well in places like the Netherlands, where the state pretty much has full control of land supply. They make it, the Dutch make the land to allow the new build to be built on their polders. Then they set the codes, the zones, everything else that they want from it, and they do it very, very well. How does our land supply system work? What tends to happen is the council sort of ask for people to knock on doors of farmers and say, have you got any land? It's a completely different game. And in places like Nottingham, it couldn't be more different. It's almost the inverse of what's envisaged in somewhere like Nottingham. And I think Laura speaks very well on that. I think, she's struggling in particular with understanding how a concept from somewhere like Phoenix, Arizona can be transplanted onto somewhere like Nottingham City. Third point, in the planning white paper, it effectively says this is step one. Step two is the code. We've now got the model design code. In the model design code, there's a lot of stuff about what they call FAR, which is floor area ratio. And I just want to make one point, which is essentially that's an American system of measurement of land economy. We don't use it in Britain. I don't think they use it anywhere in Europe. And Andres Duany, who you might refer to as, the king of coders, in his second version of his famous book, Suburban Nation, he actually warns against FAR as a yardstick for quality. And again, I'll show you why in a second. Fourth point, gentle density, which essentially is a shorthand, I think, for historic massing or form. I actually think this is a very irrelevant fixation at the moment. We should be talking about how our streets work, how we can effectively create connected networks which have got filtered permeability. So people can't drive everywhere and people have to walk and people have to cycle. And there's very little in the design code about that. It's far more about, how should we set the eaves? So how should we set the fenestration? And I am really puzzled how in 2021, somehow that kind of interest in stylistic architecture and so on has somehow become more relevant than potentially how we innovate and how we create the next generation of housing. And that leads me on to innovation. The term in the planning white paper that we'll have provably popular design. It means to have anything that's provably popular, you have to demonstrate to somebody a set of pictures and ask them, of these designs that have already been built, which do you like the most? Which are the popular designs in this area? And that means you're retrospectively referencing everything that's been built up until that moment. So essentially, provably popular guarantees we replicate, that we don't innovate. And frankly, I think with things like climate change and so on, and in particular, the need to use land more intelligently, we need to be looking at all the new ideas and testing out whether they work. And I'll show you some examples in a second, one in particular in Cambridge, which I think is absolutely brilliant, but would not get through this system because it would be too innovative. And finally, this is a kind of cheap shot really, but frankly, all this is tinkering until they sort out the Highways Act. We've got a 41-year-old Highways Act where it puts an onus on everybody in every highways authority to make sure that vehicles and traffic can flow freely, and literally makes them a criminal for doing anything else. So, it's sort of tinkering until somebody says, what, highways engineers, they also need to think in terms of place and the quality of place and how it works. So quick reference on my Andres Duany, this is him. This is his actual words. Is a poor predicator of physical form, should not be used when the plan is to conserve and enhance neighborhood character. By contrast, traditional design standards, height, plot coverage, setbacks, build to lines, these are the things that work, And he makes the point, I'm not going to read through all this, we haven't got time, but he makes the point that builders will use FAR to explain that if you set a target of, say, 1, where you thought the ground floor was going to be 50% of the plot and the first floor was going to be 50% of the plot, what they will do is instead they will just fill the plot with a bungalow, and you'll get this kind of stuff. This is what FAR does in places like Phoenix. You get wall-to-wall bungalows with gaps between them, a little more than just a fire break. And sometimes you don't even get that. You get extruded bungalows, where essentially they're beating the system by building FAR, but building it as a single-story structure. So we've got all this to come if we're not careful. This is Cambridge. This is a view of most of the city. You'll see down here the big Adam Brooks Hospital, actually where AstraZeneca's based. I'm always puzzled why they call it an Oxford vaccine, because really it should be an Oxbridge one. And this is the fantastic area that's been built around it, using a design code, and much of it's worked very well, although the architects of the best schemes say that the bits that they've done outside the design code. This area over here is the phase I want to show you in a second. This is the type of thing that comes forward. When somehow the city manages to get a big strategic site away and design code it works well, but that's 2,300 homes, and it's got a 140-acre park. So, it's a rarity. This is the commonplace one, this one here. And if you have a look at this, this is the proposal that came forward. So here is a secondary school. This is the playing fields. This is the field beyond it, agricultural land until literally this year. And forward comes the proposal, and you can see how these houses here, they butt up to the houses along here, but there is no connection anywhere at all into the school playing fields. And likewise, if you go down the western perimeter of it, there's no connection through here where there should be. In fact, there's only one way in and one way out. You've got a bellmouth here, takes you out into what they call Warts Causeway. And as you can see here, you've got a thing called Busgate, which means you can't drive your car down there during the school, the hours in the morning when you don't want to go to school. So all the parents that can't walk the kids north to the school or west and round to the school will get in the car, and they can't drive down Warts Causeway because there's a bus gate, and then they will have to drive even further. So instead of being able to get into town and round like that, they'll end up driving down to here, or perhaps they'll drive up and round. And so that kind of classic sort of pratfall of the planning system, where you get a site like this that's not connected, is what I think the planning system should be focused on. I really don't see what all this discussion is about gentle density. It should be gentle movement, effectively low carbon movement. It's far more important. And this is the planning white paper front cover picture. It's of a scheme called Tregonwell Hill in Newquay in Cornwall. One of the things you notice is, first of all, it has almost no vegetation in the street. It has no street trees, and it's extraordinarily hard. All it has, really, to soften its impression is these pastel colors and this traditional form. But this edge is a no frontage. There's no access to this road at all. It's an A-class road. And most of the car parking is in courts behind, and we know that it's very inefficient because all the data on places like Poundbury and in particular Upton show that you're using about 55% of your land. And in places like Cornwall, where they get flash rainfall at very high levels, you actually need a drainage system. You go to Truro, which is about 10 minutes drive away. They've actually got rills in the middle of the road to deal with the fact that the rain that falls there needs to be channeled away. There's none of that here. They don't seem to get it. They don't seem to understand. And when you get to the edge of the scheme, this is the A road here. No route in or out on foot, no way of getting out onto this road on your bicycle, no bicycle lane, nothing. So essentially what you're doing is you're building a pod. You're not building a connected place in any way. And that development on the front cover of the planning white paper for me, it's just gives you a clue that people have got no idea what's going on. And when you talk to people who sort of are on the fringe of this, they openly look at you and say, well, it wasn't us. Had nothing to do with it. It was beyond our control. And I think what you're seeing is a sort of ideology about what things should look like, taking over what really things should be doing. And frustrated connectivity is so widespread, we almost need a law against it. This isn't development from the 90s. This is a development from the current generation. And here, the planning authority has accepted it's a good idea to protect these people who didn't know there'd be a new development next to them from having any of these people in the new development next to them, even walking through the streets which they connect into. This is absolutely, to me, completely insane. And this is where the focus should be. And on things like this, this is the development, again, where there are photographs of it in the planning white paper. This is the access to it. This is the bit that's controlled by the highways engineers. Until we get that Highways Act, you can show all the pastel colored houses you want. They're completely irrelevant. And my final point, just to sort of show that I'm scared about the fact the planning white paper has removed the word innovative. So historically, you used to be able to get what were called gummer houses in the middle of nowhere on the grounds that they were sensational and they were innovative, and you could essentially get around every element of the planning system because of that sensational good quality. Now it just says they've got to be beautiful, and there's no innovative word. And I think innovation is really being challenged. And in Cambridge, where they've been pioneering lots of ideas, this is a development that is built at a FAR of 1. So if you were an American, you'd understand a FAR of 1, probably bungalows. But here they've got 3 rows of mews houses, 43,500 square feet to the acre. There is 43,500 square feet of housing here. There is nothing in Britain like this. There's nothing like this in Western Europe for direct access street houses where everyone has their own private amenity space, where they've all got photovoltaic roof tiles, where they've all got PIR controlled on plot integral garages. Every single one of these houses is 2,000 square feet or more. This is some of the most impressive housing I've ever seen. It's all code level 4 or code level 5. And it's been completely ignored because it doesn't look like that wishy-washy picture from Cornwall. So that's really all I want to say, except for I'm not very happy.